It had been a muggy day in North Texas on July 6, 2019, but the oppressive heat began to let up right as the sun set, and by 7 p.m., it had become an ideal summer night of about 73 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it seemed like the perfect Saturday night to go out in town. But 49-year-old Manuela Allen, known to her friends and family as just Manu, along with her husband Peter, had the house all to themselves that evening. So instead of going out to enjoy the pleasant summer weather, they decided instead to have a relaxing night in, just the two of them, on the couch just watching TV together. Peter and Manu had not had many evenings alone like this in their 23 years of marriage, and that was because they had spent most of those years raising their 4 kids. So this was a house that had constantly buzzed with activity and noise. But now, all but one of their 4 kids had graduated from high school, and their oldest son was away at college, so the house was getting quieter. And Manu and Peter were already thinking about how someday soon it might just be the two of them living here. And as much as they loved their children, it was nights like this that made them kind of look forward to the day that they would be empty nesters. Peter grabbed his glass that contained some vodka from the end table and took a sip, and then he and Manu leaned back on the couch to watch a replay of a Texas Rangers baseball game. Manu loved sports, and while baseball was not her favorite, it would have to do until football season rolled back around. Manu and Peter lived in the small Texas town of Olney with a population of just 3,000 people, and the nearest city with a major football team was over 2 hours away. But both Manu and Peter were teachers at Olney High School, and so during football season, they went to watch their beloved Olney Cubs play every Friday night. Manu didn't care that the Cubs were on the 3rd longest losing streak in the state of Texas. She just loved going to support her students who were on the team, and she enjoyed the camaraderie of sitting in the stands along with her friends and her family. As a teacher, Manu felt responsible for her students, even when they were outside the classroom. So she dedicated a lot of her time to tutoring and mentoring students, especially the ones that seemed to have the most issues, even beyond just schoolwork issues. Kids that had problems at home or kids who had behavioral issues. Manu was all about helping those kids. But the upcoming school year and the roaring crowds in the stands on Friday nights felt really far away for Manu on this relaxing summer evening, and the sound of the baseball game on TV started to become white noise for her, and by 10 p.m., she could barely keep her eyes open. Peter noticed his wife nodding off, and he gently nudged her and asked if she wanted to go to bed. Manu looked over at the clock and said she should get some sleep. Peter gave his wife a kiss, and Manu stood up, and she shuffled down the hallway, entered the master bedroom, and closed the door behind her. Peter would not be joining his wife tonight in the master bedroom. He and Manu had this understanding that on any night when Peter drank, even if it was just one drink, he would have to sleep on the couch. So, with his glass of vodka still half full, this would be one of those nights. Peter continued watching TV and slowly nursing his drink, and he started to feel tired. And then around 11:30, the couple's 20-year-old son, Darian, came home. He let himself in with a key, nodded to his dad, and went upstairs to his own bedroom. But then, around 15 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. Peter stood up and groaned a bit as he walked bleary-eyed towards the front door. He unlocked it and opened it up. And outside the door stood the couple's 15-year-old daughter, Kiara. She said hi to her dad, walked right past him, and went straight to her room. Peter sat back down on the couch. The couple's 18-year-old daughter, Melanie, was away on a weekend trip with her friends, so she wasn't expected home. And at this point, it was close to midnight, so Peter dimmed the lights, reclined on the couch, and slowly drifted off to sleep while the TV stayed on at a low volume. A little after 8 a.m. the next morning, Peter woke up feeling like he could have used maybe another hour or two of sleep. Now, it was Saturday, and if Peter wanted to, he could keep sleeping, but even on these weekends, Peter just could not seem to sleep in. He just automatically got up. So Peter climbed up from the couch, grabbed his computer, and then went back to the couch to read some news online. At the same time Peter was doing this, his daughter Kiara had just woken up as well, and she was getting ready to go to the gym, but first, she wanted to put her dirty clothes in the washing machine. The Allen house had 5 bedrooms, but it was still a fairly compact house, just a little over 2,000 square feet. And the house was laid out in a way where Kiara actually had to go through her parents' master bedroom, which was right next to her own bedroom, in order to get into the laundry room. So Kiara stepped out of her room and then tried turning the knob to the master bedroom, but she found the door was locked from the inside. Kiara walked down the hall and saw her dad on the computer, and she asked him where Mom was. And Peter just said, "Oh, check the master bedroom." Kiara said she already had, and the door was locked. Peter then told his daughter to just go around through the garage, because in their house, the master bedroom had 2 entrances. There was one in the hallway inside of the house, which is the door that was locked, and then the other entrance was through the laundry room on the other side, which connected to the garage. So Kiara stepped outside of the house and went into the garage, and she walked into the laundry room, and then she reached the door that led into the master bedroom, and when she tried the doorknob, it was unlocked. So she swung it open, she stepped inside, and she froze, because what she saw was horrifying. Kiara turned and ran back outside, back around into the main house, ran to her dad and said, "Mom is not in the bedroom," and there was blood everywhere. Peter instantly sprung up, raced outside into the garage and into the master bedroom, and right away he stepped in this big puddle of blood in the carpet, and he looked around the master and there really was blood everywhere, and his wife was nowhere to be seen. Peter instantly thought his wife must be badly injured somewhere, so he ran from the master bedroom, with Kiara now following behind him, back into the garage and then out to the driveway, and that's when he realized Manu's car was gone. Peter turned to his daughter and said, Mom must have hurt herself and driven herself to the hospital. And so Peter called his wife's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. So a few minutes later, Peter and Kiara got into his car and they sped to a nearby hospital, thinking that's where Manu's going to be. But when they got there, Peter slowly drove through the parking lot of the emergency room looking for Manu's white SUV, but they didn't see it anywhere. So they parked the car and they went inside the hospital and asked the staff if Manuela Allen had been admitted, and they said no. So Peter and Kiara left that hospital, went to another nearby hospital, but again, Manu's car was not there, and the staff said she had not admitted herself. And so Peter and Kiara returned home, and at this point, Peter dialed 911. And he explained to the operator that his wife was missing, and there was blood all over her bedroom. The first officer who arrived at the Allen house met with Peter outside. He asked Peter what was going on, and Peter told the officer that he really had no idea. His daughter Kiara had come to him that morning, saying their mom was gone, and there was blood all over the bedroom, and then he went and checked, and he saw the same thing, and then he went out to the driveway, and he noticed his wife's car was gone. Peter explained that he and Kiara then drove to 2 hospitals thinking his wife must have gotten hurt and then driven herself to a hospital, but when they got to the 2 hospitals, his wife wasn't there and they said they had not seen her. The officer noticed that as Peter was explaining the story, he seemed totally calm and not shaken or panicked or really showing any kind of emotion, and that just seemed unusual to the officer, considering the circumstances Peter had just described. I mean, his wife, at a minimum, seems to have been gravely hurt if she's not already deceased. And so you would think that would elicit a bigger reaction. But the officer kept that to himself, and instead he had Peter lead him inside the residence to the master bedroom. And the first thing the officer noticed was that the bed had been stripped bare, and there was a bloody pillow on the floor next to the bed. And he did see blood spatter all over the room, across the mattress, the closet doors, and the wall. In fact, there was so much blood that the officer did not believe a person could survive having lost that much of it. And so he wondered to himself why Peter didn't immediately call 911 instead of getting in the car with his daughter and driving around to various hospitals first. It seemed obvious this was an emergency, so why wasn't it treated that way? Then the officer noticed something else on the bedroom floor. It was a knife. And so at this point, it was obvious this was a crime scene, so he asked Peter and Kiara to clear out of the master bedroom and go wait for him on their couch. And so after the father and daughter had stepped out of the room, the officer walked outside and went to the garage. And immediately, he saw bloody streaks on the ground, and he traced them through the laundry room and back to the door of the master bedroom. And he recognized these bloody streaks had to be drag marks. Everything the officer saw painted a picture of a very violent struggle having taken place in the bedroom, most likely sometime during the night. The officer then walked back into the house and observed bloody footprints leading from the master bedroom to the kitchen, right to a spot next to the refrigerator. And so the officer walked into the living room where Peter and Kiara were, and he asked Peter about these footprints and, why would somebody go into the kitchen potentially? And Peter explained that actually his wife kept her keys on a hook right next to the refrigerator, and her keys were gone along with her car. And so at this point, the officer radioed dispatch for help and said the police should now be on the lookout for Manu's vehicle, because clearly either Manu or someone who harmed Manu had taken the keys and taken the vehicle. A few minutes later, Sergeant Dan Birbeck of the Young County Sheriff's Department, along with a couple of local police from Olney, pulled up in front of the Allen house. And the officer who had first arrived on scene walked up to Birbeck and briefed him on what he had seen. After being briefed up, Sergeant Birbeck immediately walked into the Allen house and told Peter and Kiara that they would need to step outside. As Peter and his daughter walked out onto the porch, Peter told Birbeck that actually one of his other kids was still in the house upstairs. So Birbeck told the father and the daughter to stay outside, and then Birbeck walked into the house and upstairs to a second-floor bedroom, opened the door, and found 20-year-old Darian inside with his headphones on playing video games. Birbeck asked Darian to come outside with him, and Darian, who looked very confused, asked what was going on here. But Birbeck just said he needed Darian to leave the house right now. So Darian just did as he was told and stood up and followed the detective downstairs, and then he, along with Birbeck, joined Peter and Kiara outside on the porch. Once they were out there, Birbeck began questioning them, starting with the husband, Peter. Birbeck asked Peter, why did you sleep on the couch that night instead of in your bed with your wife? Peter explained the agreement he had with Manu, that whenever he drank, no matter how much, he would sleep on the couch. Now, Sergeant Birbeck kept this to himself, but right away he wondered, why would you have that agreement in place? Was Peter like a maniac when he drank? Did he get violent? What was going on here? Birbeck then proceeded to ask each member of the family if they had heard anything unusual during the night before, because Birbeck assumed someone in the house must have heard something considering the crime scene in the master bedroom, and the couch where Peter slept was only about 20 steps away from the master bedroom. Kiara was in the bedroom right next door to the master bedroom, and Darian was right above it in the upstairs bedroom. It just seemed impossible that such a violent struggle could have taken place with them not hearing anything. But Peter said he really heard nothing, aside from the sound of an engine, which he thought could have been his wife's SUV, starting up around dawn, and he said the sound actually woke him up, but he went right back to sleep and figured it was not a big deal, whatever it was. Birbeck asked Peter, is it normal for your wife to just get up and leave in the middle of the morning like that? Didn't you think to maybe ask her where she was going? Peter replied that it was not his job to keep tabs on his wife. Darian, who had been upstairs, said the whole night he'd had his headphones on and was playing video games. The only thing he said he heard over the course of the whole night was a rustling sound coming from the kitchen, sometime between maybe 3 and 5 a.m., but he figured it was just his dad maybe getting a snack. And then Kiara, who was in the room right next door to where her mother appeared to have been in some life-and-death struggle, said she really had heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now, Birbeck, by this point, looked totally stunned by their answers, and so Kiara, who kind of picked up on his suspicion, she quickly explained that she had been out that night, and when she got home, she went straight to her room, slipped into her bed, put her earbuds in, which would have nullified the noise, and she FaceTimed with her boyfriend. And then after the call, she fell asleep still with the earbuds in her ears, which again could have prevented her from hearing anything. Birbeck didn't know what to believe here, but he just still felt like something was off. Maybe these family members know more than they're letting on. But he obviously had no proof, and so Birbeck told the family that, when he was done here at the house, he wanted them to come to the station so he could speak to them further. It was around this time that Lieutenant David Wilk was driving past the Allen family house when he saw the yellow crime scene tape stretched out around their property. Now, Lieutenant Wilk worked for the sheriff's department that was the next county over, so he had no idea what this crime scene tape was about, but he did know the Allens personally. In fact, his son was a football player at Olney High School, and the boy adored Manu. So Lieutenant Wilk just really liked the Allen family, and seeing the crime scene tape, it just made his stomach drop, because he knew, obviously, something bad had happened. Wilk immediately pulled over, got out of his car, and introduced himself to a local police officer he saw standing outside of the residence. And Wilk asked the officer, what's going on here? And the officer told Wilk that Mrs. Allen was missing, and it didn't look good. Wilk asked if there was anything he could do to help, and the officer told him that actually right now, other patrol units were out looking for Manu's white SUV, and so if Wilk wanted to, he could join in that search. And Wilk said yes, where should I look? And the officer suggested that maybe he explore the recreational area around Lake Cooper, which was a very popular swimming hole about 8 miles north of town. And so the officer gave Lieutenant Wilk a description of Manu's vehicle and her license plate number, and then Wilk left, got back in his car, and began driving north until he reached the lake area. There, he pulled into the recreational area and began driving along the perimeter of the lake. And as he approached a boat ramp, something on the other side of the lake near the dam drew his attention. It was a white SUV, just like Manu's missing vehicle. And so Lieutenant Wilk parked, got out of his car, and walked around the lake to where this white SUV was parked. And as Wilk got closer to it, he could see there was nobody in or around the SUV. He could also see that the SUV appeared to be stuck on a large mound of dirt, with all 4 wheels kind of hovering off the ground, as if somebody had driven it there, gotten it stuck, and then left. Wilk approached the driver's side of the vehicle, and he noticed there were brown smears near the door handle. He leaned in closer, and he saw that these smears were clearly bloody fingerprints. So immediately, Wilk turned on his body camera and proceeded to film and photograph the car, both outside and in, and also the area around it. And then when he was done, he decided to just go ahead and search the whole area, because obviously, this could be connected to Manu, and maybe she was out here somewhere. And so Wilk walked towards a fence that was a short distance away from the car, and then once he got there, he turned around and just began scanning the entire area. And that's when something else caught his eye. It was something off in the distance, beneath a thicket of trees. It looked sort of like a pile of laundry on the ground. Wilk began walking towards it, and as he did, he realized this was not just some pile of laundry. It looked like it was the outline of a white bed sheet, and very clearly this sheet was wrapped around something fairly big. And so Wilk picked up his pace a bit, and as he got closer, he began to see there were bloodstains on the outside of these sheets, and then when he was right on top, it was obvious that there was a dead body wrapped up inside of the sheets. Wilk had a sick feeling because he was sure the person who was inside of these sheets would be identified as Manu. And so he called into the Young County Sheriff's Department and said he'd found a dead body, and it was almost certainly the one they were looking for. Back at the Allen house, Sergeant Birbeck heard about the discovery of a body on his radio. And so now that this was officially a homicide case, he reached out to the state police, known as the Texas Rangers, for help. He arranged for Peter, Kiara, and Darian to be taken to the nearest Texas Ranger station, and then he got into his cruiser and drove down to the lake, as other county and state police headed that way as well. Birbeck arrived at the lake, and Lieutenant Wilk led him to the body that was still wrapped in the sheets. Since Wilk was not working the case in any official capacity, he'd left the body as he'd found it. So Sergeant Birbeck leaned down and began pulling away the sheets and also some yucca leaves that had covered up the victim's face. And then once the victim was exposed, Lieutenant Wilk, who was standing nearby and who knew Manu personally, was able to positively identify her. Manu was deceased. Birbeck and a few of the other officers who had arrived put up crime scene tape while they waited for a forensics team to get there. Birbeck turned to one of the officers and shared his opinion that the killer was almost certainly someone Manu knew. He pointed out that the violence inside of her home was so brutal that it just seemed personal, and also the fact that her face seemed to be covered up with leaves when they found her, well, that was something he'd seen before when the killer was someone close to the victim. Then Birbeck radioed the Texas Rangers down at the station where he'd sent Manu's family, and one of the Rangers broke the news to Peter that unfortunately his wife's body had been found. Now, by this point, Peter and Manu's oldest daughter, Melanie, had returned from her overnight trip, and their oldest son had also come back from his college campus, and so they were also with Peter and Kiara and Darian at the station. And so the Rangers watched Peter closely as he turned and told the 4 children the news about their mother. The 2 oldest immediately broke down and cried, and Kiara, who had first discovered the blood in the bedroom, collapsed to the floor. But Darian, who said he'd been up all night playing video games, didn't break down. He just walked away and sat in a corner by himself. The Rangers noticed this and actually went to another room to talk about how odd it was that Darian had not started crying and had just sort of sat down. So they decided Darian should be the first person they speak to. And so a few minutes later, one of the Rangers sat down with Darian in an interview room and asked him how he had been getting along with his mother in recent weeks. And Darian admitted that he and his mother had actually been arguing a lot about his college plans. Darian was 20 years old, but he spent basically all of his time in his room playing video games. Now, Darian was perfectly fine with that. He figured he would get his life together at some point, but Manu wanted him to act now, to go enroll in college. But Darian said he didn't want to go back to school and just sort of wished his mom would leave him alone. After this, the Ranger just asked Darian point blank if he had anything to do with his mother's death. And Darian was immediately adamant that no, he would never hurt his mom. So the Ranger asked him if he would consent to being fingerprinted, and Darian said yes, of course. Peter was the next to be interviewed, and he was unemotional just like he had been with police at the house. The Ranger thought this was strange, so he pointed out that Peter seemed to be handling the situation quite calmly. Peter explained that his background was he had been in the Army as a part of their Special Forces unit, the Green Berets, and so he had been trained to keep cool under pressure, and that was just what he was defaulting to. But Peter clearly understood what the Ranger was hinting at here, that he was suspicious of Peter, so Peter quickly added that of course he wanted justice for his wife here. And then after that, Peter said very calmly that he also owned a whole lot of firearms and a whole bunch of ammunition, and he'd make sure his wife's killer saw justice one way or the other. The Ranger just stared at Peter for a second, not convinced if Peter really was being genuine about potentially going out and seeking vigilante justice, or if maybe this was just performative, that this was Peter's way of kind of acting out his emotions. And so the ranger decided to just kind of move on. And he asked Peter, you heard that car start sometime in the morning and you believed it was your wife's car. How did you hear that noise? How did that wake you up? But the violent attack on your wife in your bedroom just down the hall didn't wake you up. Peter said he couldn't really offer an explanation, but he did offer a theory, which was that maybe Manu's killer put their hand over his wife's mouth. Sometimes violent struggles are silent, he said. The ranger couldn't help but just shake his head. At this point, the ranger was starting to feel like Peter had already thought of an answer for everything, like he had prepped for this interview. The pair spoke for a bit longer, kind of rehashing details, and then at some point, the ranger thanked Peter for coming in and told Peter that somebody would follow up with him soon. After that, the rangers would speak to the two oldest Allen children separately, and then finally, after the longest day of their lives, the Allen family were told they could go. However, they were told they were not allowed to return to their home because their house was now a crime scene. So Peter made a few phone calls, and a friend agreed to let them stay at his Airbnb until they could go home. The next day, Sergeant Birbeck got a call from the medical examiner who had Manu's autopsy results. The medical examiner revealed that Manu had been stabbed multiple times, and she had defensive wounds on her hands. She had also been strangled, and her neck was broken. And what's more, after Manu had been taken to the lake, the killer had shot her in the face after she was dead. The violence had been even more extreme than Birbeck realized, and this only convinced him further that Manu's killer had to be somebody close to her that had some sort of personal issue with her. Then Birbeck and members of the state police met with forensics investigators who had processed the scene out by the lake, and they had found shoe prints in the mud near Manu's stranded SUV, and bicycle tracks that led away from the SUV out of the recreational area and onto the main road. And so while investigators followed up on these shoe prints and bike tracks, word of Manu's murder quickly spread through the small Texas town. Students at Olney High School, where Manu worked, were devastated when they learned of the death of their beloved teacher. And also rumors began to fly, in particular on a Facebook group called Rants and Raves, where citizens of Olney voiced their theories about what they thought happened in the Allen house on the night of the murder. And most of those amateur theories pointed the finger at Peter. And Peter suddenly began noticing that people around town were treating him differently. They were treating him with suspicion. A few days after Manu's death, Peter and his kids were finally allowed to return to their family home. And when they got there, Darian helped his father secure the house by bolting the windows shut, and Peter said he would sleep with a gun under his pillow because he said the killer was still out there. The next morning, Peter was contacted by Birbeck and asked to come in for another interview. And so Peter drove to the station, where Birbeck and a Texas Ranger met him and led him into an interview room. The Ranger began the interview by asking Peter why someone might want to kill his wife. In response to this question, Peter referred to his large collection of guns. He said he had a ton of them, at least maybe 100, and a lot of people knew about them. So he said, maybe somebody broke into the house to try to steal the guns. And actually, Peter said he had a pistol, a communist block pistol, that he kept in a drawer, and when he had finally gotten back to his home the day before, he noticed that that pistol was missing. Birbeck noted everything Peter was saying in his memo pad, and he began to feel even more confident that Peter did have something to do with his wife's murder. Birbeck felt like Peter was trying to influence the investigation by suggesting an angle that would divert attention away from him. So Birbeck and the Ranger stepped out of the room and talked for a second and decided to shift to a more confrontational tone with Peter. So they went back into the interview room and they revealed to Peter that in the master bedroom where his wife was horribly attacked and killed, they had found a bloody sock which matched footprints left by the killer. And it happened to be the exact same type of compression sock that Peter wore because they found socks just like those in his drawer. And so they asked Peter to please explain that. And Peter said he really couldn't. He just kept repeating that he did not hurt his wife. And so at some point, the Ranger asked how someone other than the family would know exactly where Manu kept her car keys, because that's where the footprints went, right next to the fridge, and the keys were gone, and the car was gone. And Peter just lowered his head and stared down at the floor and said again, he just had no explanation. And so Birbeck and the Ranger continued drilling Peter, trying to get more information from him, but Peter really didn't have any more information. He really stuck to this idea that he did not do anything wrong. And so eventually, at the end of the interview, it was clear there was not enough evidence to arrest Peter, and so Peter was told to go home, and that if they needed him again, they'd be in touch. Sergeant Birbeck was sitting in his office that afternoon when he got a report from one of the Rangers who had been out in the field canvassing for witnesses. Birbeck learned that the officer had made contact with an oilfield worker who was on duty in the area near Lake Cooper on the same morning Manu's body had been found. The worker had been out near the recreation area when he noticed someone on a bicycle pedaling away from the lake and in the direction of Olney. The worker stated that this actually struck him as pretty odd because it was so early in the morning, just after dawn, and even though people did bike in that area, he never saw people biking that early in that area. However, the worker said he didn't really get a good look at the person riding the bike. He could only remember that the bicyclist wore shorts and had a backpack on. And so Sergeant Birbeck assigned 2 investigators to contact area businesses along the route from Lake Cooper to Olney to see if any of them had surveillance cameras that were running that morning that maybe picked up some footage of this person on the bike. And sure enough, the investigators found a local bank whose surveillance footage outside had captured an individual on a bicycle wearing shorts and a backpack, just like the oilfield worker had described. Birbeck took a look at this footage, and he was unable to make out the facial features of the individual on the bike. However, he was able to glean enough information from the footage about the person's general age, sex, and build to potentially narrow the suspect pool down. Birbeck was also still convinced Peter had something to do with his wife's murder, but he knew he didn't have enough evidence to move forward with an arrest. But what he could do was try to rule out other possibilities, like, for example, Peter's theory about a burglar trying to steal his guns, because if he could rule that out, it would only help strengthen the case against Peter. So Birbeck began looking into recent gun burglaries in the area, and there was only one. And the homeowner who was targeted happened to be the father of a friend of Darian Allen's. Birbeck wondered if that was more than just a coincidence. After all, everyone in the town of Olney was connected by no more than 2 degrees of separation, so maybe it didn't mean anything. But Birbeck knew he would have to dig into it further. So he began reading the reports that were made from this burglary investigation, and in examining the leads that had been developed, one name stood out, and that name was Corey Taylor. Corey was a young guy who was a loner, who was known around town as a troublemaker, and he'd had numerous run-ins with law enforcement, and he also had what looked like a love affair with guns. Birbeck found a video on Corey's Snapchat of him showing off a semi-automatic rifle with a sight attached to it. So Birbeck decided to pay Corey a visit. He drove to Corey's apartment complex and began walking towards Corey's place. And as Birbeck made his way towards the stairwell, he saw something that made him slow down and then back up. Because in the storage space underneath the stairs right in front of him was a bicycle. Birbeck knelt down to inspect the tread pattern on the bicycle's tires, and he wasn't 100% sure, but the treads looked a whole lot like the bicycle tracks that were found down by the lake. Birbeck took a picture of the treads and then proceeded up the stairs to Corey's apartment. When he got to the door, Birbeck knocked, and Corey opened it up. Birbeck introduced himself, and Corey allowed Birbeck inside. And right away, Birbeck noticed that Corey appeared to be very nervous, like he couldn't even stand still. Birbeck asked Corey if he knew about what happened to Manu Allen, and Corey said he was aware of what happened to Mrs. Allen. He said he knew her as Mrs. Allen because he knew her from his high school, Olney High School, where she worked. And he said everybody knew what happened to her. It was horrible. But Corey said he didn't know her well, and he'd never been inside of her house. Birbeck then asked Corey if he owned the bike that was outside under the stairwell. And Corey said no, the bike was not his, it belonged to his friend, Julius Mullins. Birbeck recorded this name in his notepad, and he and Corey talked for a few minutes longer, and then he left. And within a day, investigators had tracked down this new person Corey had mentioned, Julius Mullins, and they brought him in for an interview. Investigators asked Julius where he was on the night of July 6th, and Julius said that he had gone to a party. Afterward, he had gone to Corey's apartment, let himself in, and crashed there. He said he didn't actually see Corey that night, so he wasn't sure if Corey was actually in the apartment or not. And so this sounded pretty odd that he just crashed at Corey's place and didn't even know if his friend was there, but it sounded like the two were close friends and maybe this was normal. And so eventually the investigators just asked Julius if he would submit fingerprints and DNA, and Julius voluntarily submitted both and was then allowed to leave. A day later, one of the rangers who had been working the case returned to Corey's apartment to confiscate the bicycle that Birbeck had seen underneath the stairwell, and as the ranger was approaching the stairs, he suddenly had a chance encounter with someone he was very familiar with. On a whim, the ranger asked this person if he could look at the bottom of their shoes, and the person said, yeah, sure. So the ranger looked at the bottom of their shoes, and when he did, the ranger could barely contain his excitement, because he knew he had just broken the case wide open. Investigators would meet with this person the ranger had just happened to run into, and after that interview, they knew who had killed Manu Allen. Here is a reconstruction of what police think happened to Manu Allen in the early morning of July 7th, 2019. Around 2 a.m., Manu's killer quietly climbed through a window in the garage of the Allens household and then made their way into the hallway of the house. From there, they quietly crept down the hallway and went into the master bedroom where Manu was sleeping in the bed. Now, the killer tried to be quiet, but Manu was a light sleeper, and very quickly, they woke Manu up. And when the killer noticed that Manu was sitting awake in the bed, looking over at them, the killer froze for a second, but then suddenly the killer reached out and grabbed a butterfly knife off the dresser and just jumped on top of Manu before she could do anything, and the killer began furiously stabbing her. Manu tried to shield herself from the knife, but the killer plunged it into her again and again in this frenzied attack, eventually rolling Manu over, jamming her head into the mattress, and then jabbing the knife into her head multiple times. And after the 47th and final stab wound, the killer dropped the knife onto the bed. But the killer convinced themselves that Manu was not dead. She was still breathing. So the killer wrapped their hands around Manu's neck and squeezed as hard as they could until they were sure she was dead. The killer then wiped the knife off on the sheets and then placed the knife into their backpack. Then they took the bed sheets and kind of wrapped them all around Manu, who was on the bed, and then they dragged Manu inside of these sheets off the bed onto the ground. Then the killer casually walked out of the bedroom into the kitchen to retrieve the car keys from the spot where Manu always kept them. And so with Manu's keys in hand, the killer returned to the master bedroom, locking the door behind them, and then they dragged Manu in the bed sheets out the other door of the master bedroom, through the laundry room and the garage, and then outside to Manu's SUV. There, the killer put Manu's body, still wrapped in the sheets, in the trunk, and then they also placed the bike that they had driven over to the Allens' house into Manu's SUV. Once Manu's SUV was all packed up, the killer hopped in the driver's seat and drove 8 miles north to the recreational area by the lake, but as they were driving along, the SUV got stuck. So at that point, the killer hopped out of the SUV and removed Manu from the vehicle and dragged her over to the spot where she would later be found. However, before the killer actually left Manu there, they pulled out a gun and shot Manu in the face, even though at this point Manu was obviously already dead. Then, after covering up Manu's face with some leaves, the killer walked back over to the SUV, took the bike out, and then pedaled away from the scene back towards town. Police would track down Manu's killer and place them under arrest. And then once they were brought into an interrogation room, investigators asked them why. Why had they killed Manu? And that's when the killer claimed that Manu's husband, Peter, had made them do it. The killer said Peter had cornered them at a convenience store and made them get into his car and put a gun to the killer's head and said, "You're going to kill my wife." But as much as investigators had suspected Peter at different times during this investigation, this story didn't make sense with the timeline of the murder. And the forensics, both the fingerprints and DNA, implicated only one person, Julius Mullins. Julius was the owner of the bike who had stored it under the stairs at his friend's apartment, but more importantly, Julius was the ex-boyfriend of Peter and Manu's oldest daughter, Melanie. The pair had dated for a year when Melanie was a junior in high school. Julius's home life was undeniably rough, and there were times when his parents would kick him out of the house and he would have no place to sleep. Sometimes the only high school coaches would let Julius, who played tight end for the football team, sleep in the gym. And on at least one occasion, when Julius had been kicked out, Manu had allowed Julius to sleep over at their house. And also, Julius was a frequent visitor to the Allens' household, but just for the day, he'd come over for a couple hours at a time to see Melanie. And so it was during these frequent visits that Julius learned where Manu kept her car keys, which is how he knew where to go in the kitchen to find them. Manu always treated Julius incredibly kindly because she was just a person who really looked out for the kids in this town. I mean, she was always spending her spare time looking after kids and mentoring kids and tutoring kids, especially kids who had rough home lives like Julius did. And so Julius was no exception to her kindness. Manu would sometimes help him with his homework and, talk to him and make sure he was doing okay. But during Manu's daughter's relationship with Julius, it seemed like Julius's behavior began to change. He was very temperamental and moody and just seemed like he was snowballing. And so eventually, Melanie broke off the relationship, and Manu kind of stopped talking to him as well, and Julius did not take it well. And this was about 7 months prior to the murder. Police noticed that when they brought Julius in for his first interview, that he had cuts and scrapes all over his arms and legs. And when that ranger went to retrieve the bike from Corey's apartment, Julius was the person he ran into who he was very familiar with because of this case. And he asked Julius to see the soles of his shoes, and when Julius showed him, it was immediately apparent that they matched the shoe prints that had been found by the lake where Manu's body was discovered. The shoes were later found to be an exact match, and the treads on Julius's bicycle were also an exact match to the tracks that were found leaving the scene. Investigators also performed a sound test at the Allen residence, with one ranger in the master bedroom and the other on the couch where Peter had been asleep, and they turned the TV on in the living room to a low volume, as it had been the night Peter fell asleep on the couch and Manu was later murdered. And the ranger in the master bedroom shouted and yelled and made all this noise, and the ranger in the living room could not hear a thing. That's how poorly sound traveled in the Allen household, which is a big reason why nobody heard what was going on in the master bedroom. And also, Kiara, when she had fallen asleep, she had her earbuds in, which did already degrade her ability to hear what was going on in the house, and Darian really had been upstairs with headphones on, which also affected his ability to hear what was going on in the house. So really, nobody heard anything. As for the knife that was found in the bedroom, it was determined to have not been the murder weapon. The knife that was used to kill Manu was found in Julius's backpack. And Peter's stolen communist block pistol was found in the home of Corey Taylor, Julius's friend, but Corey was found to not have been involved with the murder at all. Julius would eventually come clean and would admit that Peter actually had nothing to do with the murder and that Julius had acted totally alone. And it would turn out Peter's theory about the murder, the idea that somebody had maybe tried to break in to steal his guns, but then inadvertently killed his wife, seemed to be at least partially right. Julius claimed when he snuck into the house, he was looking to steal Peter's guns. Julius said he was in the process of stealing an unsecured gun from a cabinet in the master bedroom when Manu woke up. And he said his fight-or-flight response kicked in, and it led him to stab her 47 times and then strangle her, and then eventually later on also shoot her in the face post-mortem. Julius Mullins, who was 18 years old, pled guilty and was ultimately sentenced to 55 years in prison. On the morning of February 6, 1821, 4 young men stood on the deck of a small boat out in the Pacific Ocean. The sun was out, it was beautiful and warm, the water was crystal blue, but none of these 4 men were paying any attention to their surroundings. Instead, all of them were just standing there in total silence, staring at each other. Finally, one of the 4 men spoke up. His name was Owen Coffin, and he was 18 years old. And Owen, like the other 3 men, had grown up on the water. In fact, all 4 of these men had grown up on this small island called Nantucket off the coast of Massachusetts, where the main industry there was whaling, which meant sailors like these 4 men would go out and hunt whales and slaughter them for their oil. So, from the time Owen and the rest of these men were very little, they were out on the water learning how to sail, and they were also learning the customs of the sea. And there was one custom in particular that Owen wanted to talk about right now with the other 3 men. So, in a very serious and hushed tone, Owen asked the question of the other 3 men that sailors referred to as the delicate question. And after Owen asked the so-called delicate question, the other 3 men, who were already very serious and just kind of standing there in silence, suddenly their eyes started to go wide and their mouths went agape. And then again, all of the men just kind of fell into total silence. The only sound they could hear was the splashing of the waves against the side of the boat. The captain of this vessel was a man named George Pollard. He was 28 years old, and he was actually Owen's older cousin. And what George wanted to say to Owen in response to his delicate question was no. But George didn't say that. Instead, he just put his hands up over his mouth and stared kind of incredulously at Owen and the other 2 men who were also teenagers. Their names were George and Barzillai. And as he stared at these other 3 men, he realized that their answers to the delicate question was a resounding yes. They knew it had to be a yes. They had to do this. And even though George could totally override them because he was the captain and so technically in charge, he knew in this situation, under this particular custom, he couldn't overrule them. And so, with his hands still over his mouth, George just nodded a yes. Yes, let's go forward with this custom. And so, with a unanimous decision to move forward, Owen slowly reached down and pulled out the ship's logbook from underneath one of the seats behind him. And then he opened up the book and he flipped to the back pages of the logbook, which were totally blank, and he grabbed one of the pieces of paper and he ripped it out of the book. Then Owen began to rip this piece of paper into strips. First, he ripped 3 identically long pieces of paper, and he held up all 3 at the same time to show the others that these are the 3 that are the same. And each of the 3 nodded their head. Yes, we see that. And then Owen reached down, he grabbed the paper again, and he ripped a 4th strip out, and this one was dramatically shorter than the other 3. And so Owen held up this much shorter piece, and he showed Charles, George, and Barzillai, and again, they all kind of nodded in agreement. Yes, we see, that's the short piece. And so once the whole group was satisfied that they had their 4 strips, Owen took off his hat, he put all 4 of the strips inside, mixed it around, and held out his hat. It was time. The first man to reach into Owen's hat was Owen's older cousin and the captain, George. He reached in, he pulled one of the strips of paper out, closed it in his fist so he had no idea which one it was, and pulled it back and held it close to his chest. And then one by one, each of the other men did the same thing, reaching in, grabbing their strip, not looking at it, and holding it against their chest. And then once all the strips had been taken, at the exact same time, all 4 men extended their hands into the middle of the circle they were standing in, and they opened their hands palm up to reveal which strip they got. And George, Charles, and Barzillai all had the identical long pieces, and Owen, the 18-year-old, the younger cousin of the captain, the one who had ripped up the strips, he had the short strip. And immediately, when his older cousin, George, saw this, he yelled out, "No, let me take that one." But Owen said, "No, this is customary. I want this." And so after a few moments of the men kind of collecting themselves and calming down, Charles then grabbed the logbook again, flipped to the back of it, pulled out another blank page, and he ripped it into strips again, except now he was only ripping them into 3 strips, 2 long that were identical and 1 short. And once again, as he ripped them, he held them up to show the other men, to show this was a fair process. Then Charles took off his hat, put the 3 strips inside, and extended it to George and Barzillai. Owen was not a part of this round. And so George and Barzillai, one by one, reached in, took their strip, held it to their chest, and then Charles, he would take the last strip, he would hold it to his chest, and then once all the men had their pieces, they held their hands out into the middle of their now smaller circle, they opened their hands palm up, and this time it would be Charles, the man who ripped up this second round, who would discover he had the short strip. And as soon as Charles saw this, he threw it on the ground, and he ran to the other side of the boat and began screaming, "I can't do this! I can't do it!" Meanwhile, Owen, George, and Barzillai didn't even move or flinch. They just stood there waiting for Charles to calm down. Because they knew he knew this was a very important custom, and once you begin doing it, you can't just stop. Charles would have to come back over and play his role. And so after a few minutes of Charles still kind of calling out that he couldn't do this, tears are coming down his face, he finally wiped the tears, he calmed himself down, and he walked back over to the group, who again, they hadn't moved. George, Barzillai, and Owen, they're just standing there waiting to continue this custom. And so as Charles began coming back over, looking ready to continue, George, without even saying anything, reached down and unlatched a door on the side of the boat. He opened it up, he reached in, and he pulled out this long object that was wrapped in canvas. And then he handed this object to Charles. And then once Charles had possession of this object, Owen, the man who had first drawn the short piece of paper, said to the group, "Now it's time for a moment of silence," even though at this point none of the men were talking. But still, they formed a tight circle with Charles holding this object, and they all bowed their heads, and they just stood there in total silence. And then, once Owen raised his head, the other 3 did as well, and Owen, one by one, touched the shoulders of each of the men and reminded them that this had been a fair process. Then, without saying another word, Owen turned away from the group, he walked over to the edge of the boat, looking out over the water, he got down on his knees, he made sure his posture was good, and he looked out over the water. Owen had always loved the ocean, even though his own father had died out at sea. But this particular whaling expedition that Owen had been on, he thought went extremely well, and he was very proud of what they had all accomplished. And Owen was especially proud to be a part of this particular custom. This custom was one that so few people ever took part in, but all sailors knew about it. It was kind of like the forbidden custom. And here he was playing a central role, which really required a lot of strength. And so, feeling very proud of himself, Owen, after looking out over the water for a few more moments, he bent down and put his chin on the edge of the boat, which signaled to Charles it was time. And then once Charles saw that Owen was in position, he stepped away from George and Barzillai and walked over to Owen, carrying this object wrapped in canvas. And then once he was right behind Owen, without saying a word to him, he unwrapped the object. And it was a rifle. And once the rifle was uncovered, he placed the barrel against the back of Owen's head, and then he fired a shot. And instantly, Owen slumped to the ground, dead, and Charles kind of staggered back and fell on the deck and let out the strangled scream. He couldn't believe what he had just done, but he knew there was no other choice. Once they decided to do this sacred custom, they had to take it to the end. And so George, who had just witnessed the execution of his younger cousin, was deeply troubled and pained, but he too knew they had to bring this custom to the finish line, which meant it was George's turn to step forward and play his part. And so George walked up to his now dead younger cousin, and George pulled out a serrated knife and cut off Owen's head. And then once Owen's head was removed, he placed it on the deck, so Owen's face was looking away from the other men, like he couldn't see what they were going to do. And then once the head was in place, George went back to Owen's body and began cutting him open and pulling his organs out and handing them to Charles and Barzillai. George also began cutting off long strips of Owen's flesh, creating sort of like fillets. And then, even though there was a spot on the boat to have a fire, the three men decided they just could not wait. And before long, the only sound that could be heard on board this little boat floating out at sea on the Pacific Ocean was the sound of Charles, George, and Barzillai tearing into Owen's raw flesh with their teeth, turning their beards bright red with his blood. The delicate question that Owen asked the other men at the beginning of this story was one of the most feared questions amongst sailors. And it was only asked if there was a shipwreck or some sort of emergency that happened out at sea, which meant the group had almost no chance of survival. Only in those circumstances was the delicate question appropriate. And what it was, do we draw lots to determine which one of us dies so the other can eat them in order to have a better chance at survival? And so during that first round, when Owen had drawn the short strip of paper, that determined he would be the one who was murdered and eaten. And then in the second round, when Charles drew the short strip of paper, that meant he would be the one to kill Owen. On February 6th, 1821, the day that Owen posed the delicate question, he and the other three men had been lost at sea for the past 3 months after a whale had struck the side of their whaling boat and left them adrift with almost no food and no water. There had been other men on board the Essex who had died from starvation and exposure, and their bodies had been consumed by the surviving sailors until on February 6th, they were down to just these 4 men and no more bodies to eat. Which is why they decided it was time. They had to ask the delicate question. "17 days after Owen sacrificed himself so the others could eat him, another boat happened to drift past the stranded Essex boat, which now only contained Charles and George, Barzillai had died of starvation 5 days after they killed Owen, and Barzillai had been eaten by George and Charles as well. And as this other ship passed by the Essex and they looked on board, all they saw were skeletons of the men that had died and been eaten, and Charles and George were on opposite ends of the boat, curled up in a ball, chewing on human finger bones, trying to get the last bits of flesh off. And their bodies were totally emaciated, their hair and their beards were wild, they looked totally feral. And then, when this boat actually came up alongside the Essex and boarded to rescue Charles and George looked terrified. It was like they had totally lost their grip on reality. They had been lost at sea for 94 days and had consumed all of their friends, and so it makes sense they might go kind of crazy. But after this crew was able to get Charles and George fed and get them water and cleaned up, they kind of regained their composure and their sanity, and they were very thankful and happy to be alive. The story of what happened to the crew of the Essex quickly spread all around the world, and in fact, it served as inspiration for Herman Melville to write his classic American novel, Moby Dick. The next and final story of today's episode is called the Kaz II. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, 3 men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Kaz II from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Kaz II was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the 2 friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All 3 of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination, and where all 3 men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all 3 men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all 3 of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the 3 men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other 2 men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually, Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Kaz II, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all 3 men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Kaz II to make sure they knew how to do it, if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Kaz II before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the Kaz II, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on when details emerged about what happened on the Kaz II that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, 2 more people would spot the Kaz II. These were 2 men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Kaz II. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other. But independently, on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the Kaz II sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Kaz II was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Kaz II would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the Kaz II in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these 2 men who saw the Kaz II, they just saw it and thought nothing of it, because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the 2 other men had seen the Kaz II on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Kaz II. And again, these fishermen do not know the Kaz II. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing this ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Kaz II, they thought something was wrong. Because they saw the Kaz II from a distance, navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Kaz II was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Kaz II. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Kaz II with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Kaz II to see if they were okay, but no one from the Kaz II called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Kaz II, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Kaz II clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Kaz II, and when they got there, the Kaz II was gone. At this point, the Marine police got some information about the boat, Kaz II, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Kaz II. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Kaz II. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water. And from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water. And then Corey swam by himself over to the Kaz II, and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck. And right away, he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. Then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job. And so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th, so the day the Kaz set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found. And so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. On a bright afternoon in April of 1795, 37-year-old James Phipps Sr. squinted in the sun as he carefully trimmed a hedge, trying to shape an overgrown bush into a perfect sphere. James was a gardener, and he tended to the estate of one of the most prominent men in Berkeley, England, a physician named Dr. Edward Jenner, who was a leading crusader against what was then the world's most feared disease, smallpox. James did not always like his job. The days were long, the weather was often bad, and his hands were always covered in cuts and sores. But working on Dr. Jenner's estate was never dull. His boss treated an unending parade of people suffering from hundreds of small, painful sores from their tongues to their toes. These sores were how smallpox got its nickname, the speckled monster. But no matter what Dr. Jenner did to help, nearly a third of the smallpox patients died, while most of the survivors ended up with scars all over their faces. And today, Dr. Jenner was doing something particularly strange. He was deliberately exposing healthy people to the deadly disease. As James trimmed the hedge, he could look through the window into Dr. Jenner's office. The dark, wood-paneled walls were lined with cabinets full of medical supplies, and the silver-haired physician stood in the center of the room, using a mortar and pestle to grind up scabs he'd collected from other patients' smallpox sores. One by one, people went into the office and allowed Dr. Jenner to blow these scabs into their noses, sending the virus deep inside of their bodies. The doctor called this process variolation. Dr. Jenner had told James that it was better to make patients sick with a mild case of smallpox like this, rather than for them to get a much worse case naturally. After all, once a patient got smallpox, they could never get it again. James had nodded like he understood, but inside, he thought it was pretty odd for healthy people to come to the doctor to get sick. Sometimes, people died from the smallpox infection that Dr. Jenner gave them. So, James winced every time he saw the doctor blow through his straw, knowing that the patient would soon return covered in the ugly smallpox rash. Most alarming, though, James knew that one day, his 8-year-old son, James Jr., would have to go through the same ordeal. Dr. Jenner would insist. But James hoped that day was still years away. Until then, he decided to just put the frightening thought out of his mind. He stepped back again to check the shape of the hedge. It still looked a bit like an egg, so he leaned back in and kept on trimming. A few days later, James squatted beside the flower beds that lined the front of Dr. Jenner's vast, ornate home. He dug a small hole, placed a tulip bulb inside, and buried it. He moved 6 inches down and began to dig a second hole. But then, he heard footsteps coming up the walkway. James turned to see a local cattle farmer named Joseph Merritt heading towards the porch. James was surprised to see him because Joseph had come by for Dr. Jenner's clinic just a few days ago. Joseph should have been stuck at home with smallpox right now, but instead, he looked perfectly healthy. The smallpox virus that Dr. Jenner blew into his nose must not have made him sick. James lifted up a dirty hand to wave, and Joseph nodded at him before knocking on the front door and heading inside. James went back to planting tulip bulbs, but he kept thinking about Joseph. He'd never seen a person get variolated and not get sick afterwards. James tried to mind his business and focus on his work, but he just couldn't shake his curiosity. So, as he moved further down the flower bed, he peeked through a window into Dr. Jenner's clinic. Joseph sat on a wooden exam table, and to James's horror, the doctor was blowing a straw into Joseph's nose. He was exposing Joseph to smallpox again. James kept looking through the glass, wondering how Joseph had managed to avoid catching smallpox the first time. And also James thought, how sick was Joseph going to get now that he had received a double dose? About a year later, in May 1796, Dr. Edward Jenner was enjoying a quiet morning in his sunroom, sipping an after-breakfast cup of tea, when he heard a knock at his door. A few moments later, one of his servants came into the sunroom and told him that a messenger had come from a nearby village. There was a pox outbreak at one of the villagers' farms, and they needed Dr. Jenner's help. Dr. Jenner thanked the servant and immediately went to get dressed. He put on a blue coat with gold buttons and pulled his shoulder-length silver hair into a low ponytail. Then he packed his traveling medical kit with supplies, walked outside to his stable, and got on one of his horses. Dr. Jenner was the only practicing physician within 400 square miles, so he was used to traveling long distances for his patients. Luckily, this particular village was not too far away. He rode through the countryside for about half an hour, and when he spotted the farm he was looking for, he pulled on his horse's reins and slowed to a stop. Dr. Jenner got off his horse, tied the animal to a fence post, and walked towards a small house on the farm. But before he made it to the front door, it swung open, revealing a scruffy-looking man in work clothes. The farmer beckoned Dr. Jenner inside into a small sitting room. There, Dr. Jenner saw a young woman sitting on the couch, cradling her right hand. She was very pretty, with long brown hair and light eyes, but she looked like she was on the verge of tears. Dr. Jenner sat next to her and asked for her name. With a shaky voice, she said her name was Sarah Nelms. Then she held out her right hand and showed Dr. Jenner the big pus-filled sore between her thumb and pointed finger. She explained that the previous morning, she'd been out picking roses when a thorn scratched her hand. Then, this morning, Sarah had woken up with this huge sore right where the scratch had been. Now, she felt exhausted and feverish, and her hand was throbbing. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, and through sobs, she told the doctor that she was certain she had smallpox. Dr. Jenner nodded sympathetically and then gently took Sarah's hand. Her sore did look like a smallpox spot, but Dr. Jenner knew that Sarah did not have smallpox because the disease didn't start on people's hands. It started in their mouths, then spread across their faces and down their limbs. So he reassured the girl that she didn't have smallpox, but he did have a hunch about what was making her sick. Dr. Jenner turned to the farmer and asked him to point out the barn where Sarah worked. He needed to see it for himself. Moments later, the farmer led Dr. Jenner into a wooden barn where about 30 dairy cows were eating and resting. A few of the animals turned to look at the men, and Dr. Jenner approached one of them and leaned down to look at its udder. And he saw exactly what he was expecting. The cow's udder was covered in a bumpy, scabby rash. It had dozens of sores, just like the one on Sarah's hand. Dr. Jenner walked around the barn and found that every single cow had a similar rash. Dr. Jenner was not a veterinarian, but he knew that this disease was a relative of smallpox called cowpox, and it could be spread from livestock to humans. Dr. Jenner and the farmer went back into the house where Sarah was waiting, and the doctor told her that he had good and bad news. The bad news was that she had cowpox. This meant she was going to have to quarantine herself so she wouldn't spread it to anyone else, and the sore in her hand was likely going to get worse before it got better. But the good news was that cowpox was far less deadly than smallpox, so even though it would take a few weeks for her hand to heal, Sarah was very likely going to be okay. Sarah let out a small laugh of relief and let Dr. Jenner clean and dress her wound. When he was finished, the doctor shook the farmer's hand, went back out to his horse, and began his journey home. But as he rode through the countryside, an idea began to form inside of Dr. Jenner's mind, a really exciting idea. He thought about Sarah's case of cowpox that she undoubtedly got from working with those poor sick animals. It occurred to him that he had treated many milkmaids on many different farms for cowpox. However, he couldn't actually think of a single milkmaid who ever got sick with smallpox. And that reminded him of Joseph, the cattle farmer from a year ago, the one who did not get sick after his smallpox variolation. Just like Sarah, Joseph worked with cows every day, and Dr. Jenner just could not make Joseph sick with smallpox, no matter how hard he tried. This raised a question for Dr. Jenner, one that he needed to answer right away. He pressed his right leg into his horse's side, and the animal sped up from a trot to a gallop to an all-out run. Dr. Jenner held on tight, anxious to get back home. Sitting in his office chair that same afternoon, the doctor rifled through a cabinet full of local medical records. He found the file for Joseph Merritt, the cattle farmer he'd tried to variolate last year, and in Joseph's medical history, Dr. Jenner found the answer to his burning question. Way back in 1770, so 26 years earlier, Joseph had been treated for cowpox. Then, 2.5 decades later, Dr. Jenner tried to variolate him against smallpox twice, and it didn't work. It was like Joseph was already immune to smallpox, even though he'd never had it before. So Dr. Jenner wondered, what if Joseph's previous cowpox infection was what had made him immune to smallpox? And what if the doctor could use this information to help other people? Dr. Jenner might be able to deliberately expose people to cowpox, a painful but ultimately non-fatal disease, to make them immune to smallpox, a far more dangerous illness. The doctor's mind spun a mile a minute. If this idea worked, physicians could save patients from smallpox without accidentally killing them. They could stop the world's deadliest disease in its tracks. But Dr. Jenner knew he was getting ahead of himself. First, he had to prove that his cowpox theory was right. And the only way to do that would be to experiment on a patient who had never had cowpox or smallpox. And because pretty much every adult that Dr. Jenner treated had suffered from one pox or the other already, he was going to have to experiment on a child. On May 14, 1796, James Phipps Sr. held his son's hand as they walked towards Dr. Jenner's estate. They passed the hedges James had trimmed and the tulips he'd planted, but James was not thinking about his work. He was thinking about the fact that his son was about to become a human science experiment. A few days earlier, Dr. Jenner had asked James if he'd be willing to let him test his theory on Junior. The doctor believed cowpox made people immune to smallpox, so he wanted to infect Junior with cowpox, then try to infect him with smallpox. If Junior didn't get sick, it would prove the doctor's theory was correct. But if Junior did contract smallpox, it would prove Dr. Jenner wrong, and the little boy would face a 30% chance of death. At first, James said no way. Dr. Jenner's theory was mostly based on the fact that one cattle farmer, Joseph Merritt, couldn't catch smallpox. That wasn't exactly foolproof evidence. Plus, Joseph was an adult, Junior was a child, and children were almost always more susceptible to disease. James knew if he agreed, he was going to be putting his son in mortal danger. But still, James also knew that Dr. Jenner was one of the best physicians in the country, and he did trust him. But also, there was just the harsh reality that at this time, a lot of people were getting smallpox, and when they got it, a lot of them died. And so maybe putting his son in danger now was ultimately saving his life. So James ultimately agreed to the plan. He led his son up to the front door, knocked, and a moment later, a servant showed them to the doctor's office. Inside, James saw Dr. Jenner sitting next to a young brunette woman with a bandaged right hand. Dr. Jenner stood up to say hello, then leaned down and told Junior that the woman's name was Sarah and she was going to be helping with the procedure. She had actually come out of her quarantine just for this. Junior glanced at his father nervously, and James gave him an encouraging nod. While Junior sat on the exam table, Dr. Jenner unwrapped Sarah's bandage, revealing the cowpox sore underneath. Then, the doctor grabbed a scalpel from one of the cabinets and asked Junior to hold out his arm and stay still. Dr. Jenner held Junior's wrist while he brought the scalpel towards the outside of the boy's upper arm. James put a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, and Junior drew in a sharp breath as the doctor pressed the scalpel down and dragged it about an inch across his skin. Dr. Jenner made one more cut beneath the first one, then did the same thing on Junior's other arm. Then, Dr. Jenner turned to Sarah and used the same scalpel to poke a hole in the top of her cowpox sore. Yellow pus began to leak out the top, and right away, Dr. Jenner got a small spatula to gather some of it up. Junior squirmed, but James tightened his grip on his son's shoulders to keep him still as the doctor wiped the pus directly into the cuts on both of Junior's arms. Junior looked completely grossed out, and James did too, but James was also glad that at least this part of the experiment was over. He let go of his son's shoulders, and they headed back home. Nine days later, James felt like he'd made the worst decision of his life. His son had been stuck in bed for over a week with chills, body aches, and nausea. And James knew the worst was yet to come. Even if his son recovered from cowpox, which was feeling like a big if, he still had to be exposed to smallpox. Late that evening, James brought a spoonful of stew to Junior's lips, but his son refused to eat. He was too nauseous. A voice in the back of James's mind told him that he had put his son through all this suffering for nothing. But he shook off that nagging thought, then grabbed an extra blanket to keep his boy warm. Then he told his son to call for him if he needed anything at all. Then, James blew out the candle on Junior's bedside table, went to his own room, and got into bed. And he laid there, awake, worrying about his son, until eventually he drifted off to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, James jumped out of bed and immediately went to check on his son. And to his surprise, his son was awake and smiling. Junior said he was finally starting to feel better. In fact, he was even hungry for breakfast. James was so relieved, but he did know the biggest danger was still to come. A little over a month later, on July 1st, 1796, James brought his son back to Dr. Jenner's office for the second part of the experiment. Junior sat on the exam table, looking like he wanted to sprint out the door, while Dr. Jenner took a jar of reddish powder out of one of his cupboards. It was a container of ground-up scabs from smallpox patients. James looked on uneasily as Dr. Jenner sprinkled some of the scabs into the straw and told Junior to hold the straw inside one of his nostrils. Then, once it was in place, Dr. Jenner blew the contaminated red dust into Junior's nose. Over the next several days, James kept a very close eye on his son. He was terrified that he would start developing a fever or the awful smallpox sores. One morning, 4 or 5 days after their visit to Dr. Jenner, Junior woke up with a scratchy throat, and James feared that his worst nightmare had come true. He imagined all these smallpox sores popping up inside of his son's throat, spreading across his face and down his arms and legs. He felt so stupid and guilty, he couldn't believe he'd put his child in this kind of danger. But then Junior drank some water, and suddenly his voice went back to normal. And with a smile on his face, he asked his dad, "When can I go play outside again?" James let out a long sigh of relief and said, "Soon, but not yet." Over the next week or so, Junior continued to just sail along without ever getting sick. And finally, James was satisfied that his son was perfectly fine, and he did let Junior back outside to play. Dr. Jenner's experiment had worked, and though James and his son had no way of knowing it, they had just helped revolutionize medicine forever. It turned out that Dr. Jenner's theory was correct. Cowpox and smallpox were so closely related that contracting one disease made people immune to the other. Dr. Jenner wrote a report about Junior's remarkable immunity to smallpox, and he named his new technique vaccination, after the Latin word for cow. And the name stuck because Dr. Jenner had invented the world's first vaccine. But as incredible as this discovery was, Dr. Jenner's report was met with mixed reactions. It took years for other doctors to endorse smallpox vaccination, and even longer for the public to embrace it. But Dr. Jenner believed in his new methods so much that he devoted the rest of his life to vaccinating patients and teaching other doctors how to do the same. Over the next century, Dr. Jenner's smallpox vaccine saved millions of lives every year. Then, in 1967, almost 2 centuries after James Phipps Jr. took part in Dr. Jenner's experiment, the World Health Organization began a campaign to permanently eliminate smallpox. And by 1980, they did it. A disease that caused countless deaths and immeasurable suffering was literally wiped off the face of the earth. And it all began with a sick milkmaid, a gardener's son, and a very creative doctor. Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers